Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Welcome to eAccess. My name is Daniel Gorfine. I lead external affairs at a company called OnDeck, and I'm an adjunct fellow at the Milken Institute. Related and relevant to today's panel discussion, OnDeck is a financial technology company that's relying on credit and technology innovation to transform small business lending. Through the use of big data and an efficient online platform, we're able to provide capital access to businesses in many different countries around the world. Before joining OnDeck, I was actually here at the Milken Institute and led financial market policy work out of our Washington, D.C. office. I became increasingly focused on the role of technology, particularly there in financial services and markets, and over the span of a few years became increasingly optimistic that technology could help to improve billions of lives around the world by leapfrogging certain traditional physical barriers. And throughout the discussions today, we've actually been hearing a lot of reference to some of those exact themes. So I was also going to bring up the example of M-Pesa, but yet again, that's another topic that I'm sure many of you have heard today. But I think M-Pesa is a wonderful example of what technology can do. Within a very short period of time, individuals in Kenya, through mobile devices, were able to transact using electronic currencies, and it effectively plugged hundreds of thousands of people into the global financial system, and in that way also leapfrogged the lack of a traditional and robust brick-and-mortar banking system. So today's panel discussion is going to delve deeper into this thread of how technology can help to transform lives in a variety of ways, whether that's through advances in education, healthcare, energy, governance, or finance. We're joined by leaders in their respective fields who will help to highlight how quickly the world is in fact changing. So with that, what I'll do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists, and we'll run down the row here, to just briefly introduce yourself and also highlight a few of the innovations or changes that you're seeing that you're most excited about in terms of their ability to really improve lives around the world. So with that, I'll start with you, Samir.
I'm Samer Salti. I'm the founder and CEO of Zouk Capital. Zouk Capital is an investor in technology driving resource efficiency as well as renewable energy. What's interesting, we're seeing the application of renewable energy and technology in the widest sense, and the models changing in the Western world and developing. And over the past 2 years, we started investing in Africa, in Tanzania, and we're seeing models that leapfrog what we've done in Europe, going to the next stage, what we call the next generation. For example, we invested in off-grid electric in Tanzania, where the price of solar panel, the price of LED, the price of battery, and the control systems all bundled together are at such a cheap price that they could be cheaper than one kerosene light per lamp per day. Other companies like Mcopa is doing the same thing. But what is powerful about that is the change of lives that we're having. We're adding now televisions so people can watch television, free content. We're going to add refrigerators. We're going to have a major impact. The company is doing over 10,000 installations a month. This is massive. And the reason we're excited, we're learning from this for Europe. We believe the future of renewable energy is solar on your rooftop, battery in the home, control systems. How do you manage all of that? It's not going to be the same necessarily. It's a different scale and a different level. But the lessons we're learning in Tanzania, including the mobile payment and how we're installing things at the right price, we will be implementing that in Europe. The impact is massive, and we're quite excited about that.
Great, thank you. Gary.
Okay, so my name is Gary Stewart. I work with Telefonica. I'm running an initiative called Wayra Open Future in the UK. So Telefonica is basically committed about 500 million euros to focus on open innovation. This is covering everything from venture funds to an accelerator, which is what Wayra really is, which means that we invest in startups, early stage startups, and try to leverage them by try to help them scale by leveraging Telefonica to co-working spaces. In terms of we have about 12 different academies around the world, everywhere the Telefonica has an operating business, so that basically means Europe and Latin America, and then we also kind of partner in other countries where we don't have an operating business to try and extend our reach that way as well. So we have also agreements in China, in Korea, in Finland, and we're constantly trying to expand. I would say in terms of technologies that are interesting, Part of what we've done in the UK as well is we recently did a joint venture with the British government to focus on social entrepreneurship. And at the beginning, I wasn't really sure what we were to expect from it. But what we saw is that at the end of the day, entrepreneurs are basically there to solve problems. And the problems that social entrepreneurs are really focused on were problems, very basic problems related to education, health, and financial inclusion. So what we've started to do is actually partner with other corporates to try and see how we can solve those problems together. Some of the examples of startups that we're working with, I guess one of them just came in, a company called WeFarm. Basically, they realized that there were a lot of farmers in Africa or in Latin America that didn't have access to the internet and therefore couldn't benefit from all of this kind of crowdsourced knowledge. So what they did is they allowed for farmers to be able to access kind of that knowledge by using SMSs. So the way it works is they send an SMS, the farmer sends an SMS with a question to WeFarm. WeFarm then distributes it to a whole bunch of other people, both in the country and internationally, and then comes back with crowdsourced answers so that they can then kind of help the farmers to improve their quality of lives and also their productivity. So I think that's one of the examples that we have seen recently.
Great, thank you. Turn to John.
Yeah, I'm John Fallon. I'm the CEO of Pearson, which is the largest education company in the world. There's some 40,000 of us working in education all around the world. And everything that we do as a company is really trying to focus on one relatively simple to explain but difficult to resolve challenge, which is for all the money that we spend on education around the world, some $5 trillion a year, it still isn't working for far too many people. And that traditionally we've measured progress in education by inputs, percentage of spend on education of GDP, or classroom sizes, or new schools built, rather than in terms of outcomes. And we think it's time to flip that, to focus on the fact that there are still 770 million people in the world today who are illiterate, that in many African countries there's still a 50% chance that even after 5 years of schooling you'll be illiterate and innumerate at a time when we know that education is fundamental to most of the life chances that exist. As an example, a child born to a woman who herself can read is far more likely to live beyond the age of 5. And I think we're in the very, very early stages, and there's a lot of investment going into technology and education around the world that has not brought improvements in outcomes, but we're learning all the time. And I think there's a real opportunity now to combine all that we're learning about the cognitive sciences, how people learn, all that we're learning about great pedagogy, what really works and is effective in teaching, and combining that with technology to scale that and share it and make it much more effective for far more people around the world, from the world's most advanced economies to those right at the bottom of the supposed global pyramid. So perhaps in the course of the next 50 minutes or so, I'll give a few more examples of what that might look like, but that's probably a good place to leave it for now.
That sounds great. I think this theme of scalability will also come up frequently. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing technology do across all of these different verticals and industries is really in quick order and very efficiently be able to scale and impact hundreds of millions of people, whereas in the past that could take a number of years to even begin to tip the balance. But with that, Michael.
Yes, Mike Macharia. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called 76 Technologies. We are a Pan-African technology company. And I think in relative to this conversation today, maybe I could share with you one major transformational project that we've enabled the Kenyan government to sort of execute. Now, 4 or 5 years ago, we realized that the post offices were highly, we had big population of post offices centers across the country. Now, most of these post offices were becoming end of life. So you have a big infrastructure in terms of physical infrastructure. And what we figured out is, could we sort of look at creating a one-stop citizen service center? What happened was, naturally, corruption was pretty prevalent across government services. You're trying to get a national ID, you're trying to get a health insurance card. Corruption was really, really high. So what we wanted to do was use technology and bring all these services to one postal center. So across the country, we were able to run pilots, which became very successful. And today, across the country, you're able to go to a post office and get a national ID, passport, birth certificate in one-stop shop, in one area, seamlessly. Now, what has happened? Those post offices have become big centers for financial movement of government payments. So now all of a sudden the financial organizations, big banks, have had to team up with the post office to create bank cards to offer to the bottom of a pyramid. So today what happens, you can walk into any service center, which is a post office in Kenya, get access to a national ID in a predictable and corrupt-free process. Now, that initiative has gone to win global awards for the country in terms of service delivery. And today, I think, is also creating a benchmark for other countries in Africa that are willing to see how they could convert and deliver citizen services across the country. And that, overnight, has transported capability of delivery government services across the country within a period of less than 2 years. The next project, which I think is an interesting project, is a project in Kenya we are running with General Electric, which was the government decided that they do not need, they will probably not buy infrastructure in terms of healthcare, but probably outsource capability and in terms of managed services. So the government went out and sent out very, very interesting bids to implement radiology centers, lab centers, ICU theaters, and went out to national bids, global bids. And we eventually won a project with General Electric to implement across the country teleradiology capability across MRIs, ultrasound. But because we do not have enough radiologists in the country, we've been able, within the next 1 year, we'll be able to create a holistic infrastructure to be able to offer teleradiology across the country. Now, overnight, we'll be in a position to create an EMR platform, okay, which was probably the most difficult thing to do. Because now we'll be able to create an EMR record that is linked to all your images across the country. So that project alone is going to give us the whole scale overnight in terms of building a national EMR platform. Now, we are then going to complement that by rolling out what we call clinics in a container. Because we realize that the country is vast, we've sort of built a container-based solution for primary healthcare. In it, we also have technology. We have an EMR platform. We are going to then have miniature kind of medical infrastructure within the container. We're going to have mother and care, maternal health care, GP services, trauma services, but these are distributed across the country. Now, if we deploy 1,000 of these centers across the country in the next 2 years, we definitely hope that we should be in a position to treat 7 million customers or patients across the country within the next 2 years. Now, that in itself will have a fundamental impact to the way healthcare is delivered at a country level. Now, in terms of data and in terms of using data, patient data across the country, we believe that this could create a whole fundamental play in terms of, and also leapfrog in the way primary healthcare is delivered in the country. Thank you.
Yeah, so let's jump a little bit deeper then into this idea of leapfrogging, existing barriers, whether those are physical or not. And I would actually challenge here on when we think about the barriers, it's not always the lack of certain infrastructure. It can actually be completely displacing particular infrastructure, which is why innovation that you see taking place in Kenya around M-Pesa, it's also taking place in the Western world with things like Venmo that allow you to transact, again, electronic currencies just from tapping a phone. So I'll open this up to anyone who wants to jump in, but what are the types of barriers that you really believe you're either displacing or leapfrogging? Is it a lack of existing infrastructure in certain circumstances or certain types of infrastructure that should be supplanted?
The idea for us to do something in a specific country is to be able to scale it and roll it in multiple countries and cross borders with it. And if it doesn't, that it is less of interest. But why are we interested in that? We're interested in that because only by having a big goal of having a big market opportunity and a big scale, you can allow yourself to invest in the infrastructure that you need to build to actually get it to work. Even in the solar system that I mentioned, on a 2,000 installation, you can get it done. But if you really want to have impact in a country like Tanzania or Kenya or Uganda or Rwanda, in one country like Tanzania, you have 9 million homes without electricity. You're going to have to build infrastructure across the spectrum, from supply chain of the product itself to the communication infrastructure, to the sales, to the service, to the logistics, across the board. And you have to invest a huge amount of money, and you have to create the financial structure behind it to invest in it, putting all of that together is not easy. There is the credit risk of the country you're operating in, credit risk of a young company. So unless you are having a big goal, I think we will face a huge failure. So it goes hand in hand. We always want to have impact. We want to have it at a scale, because if we don't do it at scale, we actually will fail.
I mean, I would say that in education, it's really about how the technology can help you to replicate and scale things that you know already work. And a few examples of how that might work. One of the things that we find around the world is the more engaged parents are in their own kids' education, the more successful the kids need to be. To be engaged, the parents need data, they need knowledge, they need to feel able to hold schools and teachers to account and to engage in a proper discussion with them. And that's not always something that parents in poor and underprivileged communities feel confident to do. So I think one of the really interesting innovations you're seeing now is a number of groups, or certainly one organisation in India that does this very effectively, that's actually going into the home and using basic technology to give kids basic literacy tests, and then sharing that data with the students, and the students can then go into the school and say, either my kid's doing well and that's great and thank you, or actually they're in school and they're not learning anything very much, what are you going to do about it? It's something that, you know, any parent here in London or in New York or in any city does. You know, we all know what are the good schools and what gets the good results, and parents at every level of society at the bottom of the pyramid need that same data and insight and ability to act as an informed citizen. I think another way in which it can work is, we all know that in all countries, but particularly in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa or someone like India, access to good quality, well-trained teachers is very, very difficult to come by. And so something we were talking about earlier, bridge academies in Kenya, in which Pearson is a shareholder, what they're able to do is, you know, you actually employ high school graduates, normally young women, as teachers to take a class. That means you can keep the cost of the education very low, but you sustain the quality by ensuring that using basic tablet technology, the teacher is provided with the curriculum by which to do the teaching each day, and you can track that the students are actually there and that things are happening, and again, you've got the data to do it. Now, that has its limitations. It means that the education that you provide is going to be relatively rudimentary and basic, but it can be the difference between a kid being able to read after 5 years or not being able to read, and once you've got that basic literacy on, you can build from there. So I think it's sort of data, information, the action that parents need to force change or to hold people to account, and actually being able to replicate and share and scale, and lots of other examples that perhaps we could talk about later.
So I mean, what I would say is, I think that if you are in a kind of less mature market, there are probably more opportunities to do something truly disruptive. It may be the case that probably the need would be more strongly felt. There may be kind of fewer competitors. You might find it easier to do a pilot. So for example, we see that when startups come to the UK, for example, and they already started out their project originally in Slovenia or something like that, it may be easier for them to do a pilot. There may be kind of more access to the corporates. The corporates may feel kind of more willingness to try out the project. I think that where it becomes more difficult is after they've kind of done a local pilot and proven that this works in a local market, is in getting the money to kind of scale it globally, which is what I think is usually a limitation to allowing technologies that have been developed successfully in kind of smaller markets to then kind of become global. It's usually hard for them to find the money to do so. But the ability to do the initial pilot might actually be easier in those markets because, you know, in the UK, for example, if you want to do something disruptive, there are going to be a lot of people competing with you and telling you no. Maybe in other markets, you don't have those kind of barriers.
I think in our case, I think when I look at Africa, the biggest challenge is mindset. So what happens, you have a decision maker who is a gatekeeper. You have an innovator on this other side who has a great solution. Now the mindset of the decision maker, allowing this idea to permeate through his organization, is highly, most of the case, almost not accepted. And why? Because you have you have already got existing value chain partners across that whole ecosystem. So what they try and do is block the innovator. So we have many innovation hubs. We've got many innovators coming up with great ideas. The challenge is, do they have the right test platforms to execute or to try the ideas on? So what happens in our case, I give you an example. When we tried to sell this citizen service initiative, it took us 4.5 years to try and convince government it's a good idea. And it had to take the intervention of the president to say, look, why don't you pilot it? So we had to take one post office, pilot it, then they say, wow, this is amazing. Then eventually everybody said, let's rally behind this initiative. So the challenge it's not really innovation. I think it's really the people who are gatekeepers who prevent innovation from working. And we talk about Bridge Academy today, very successful in Kenya. What has happened after 6 or 4, 5, 7 years? Is it how many, 5 years? The government has sort of said, look, hold on. It's a great idea, but hold on. We may not allow you or license you to do additional training. So they are battling with the government today to try and get to get a license, or not even a license, or whatever you guys are battling with. But the problem is, yes, it's sort of a movement that eventually may also take over our mainstream education system. So if that was to happen, why is the government then holding it back? So is the case of M-Pesa. M-Pesa, for a long time, if you really asked the central bank governor 10 years ago, if he really would have allowed M-Pesa, he would have probably said no way, right? Now, M-Pesa is a movement. You really cannot stop M-Pesa. If you stop M-Pesa, the country goes up in arms, right? So really, you have to wait. It's sort of a gamble between, do you know the right people? Okay, are you able to influence the right people? Are you able to do the right pilots? Okay, it's a balance between all those conditions and ecosystem players.
Let me actually ask a closely related question to that. So what you're effectively getting at is with any kind of innovation, new technologies, you're going to threaten potentially traditional stakeholders. And those stakeholders could be governments. They could also be kind of the existing entities that have served a particular space. In all of your experience, what are you seeing? Do you see that the incumbents are looking to innovate? Are they looking to partner? Are they acting threatened and trying to clamp down on innovation? And what's been the most effective approach to kind of foster collaboration that can benefit kind of all involved parties?
Well, I think that what we're seeing is, you look at the example of Telefonica. What Telefonica realized is that if it doesn't want to end up like Kodak, it needs to actually start to work with the startups. I think at the beginning, when I first joined Telefonica, people saw startups as kind of like charity cases that we were supposed to support, or we can look at the idea that they're doing and do it better ourselves. And then I think that there were enough instances of Facebooks and WhatsApps and all of these small startups that basically disintermediated entire business lines with almost kind of this kind of quickness that all of a sudden Telefonica started to say, well, maybe we should try to work with them, which is why they created Wayra. And I think this is something that we've seen not only in Spain and Latin America and Europe, but for example, last year we were in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government is also thinking about how to spur entrepreneurship there, because the idea is that you have 50% of the population that's under the age of 25. You need to create jobs for them. Oil isn't going to last forever, so they're trying to also start to think about other ways for them to spur entrepreneurship. And the same thing's happening in Lebanon, Ukraine, all around the world. So I think that what's happening, and this is in part due to research from the Kaufman Institute as well, is that people have started to realize that entrepreneurship creates jobs, and that's probably the thing that's most important nowadays. So governments and corporates are kind of backing this whole initiative right now over the last 4 or 5 years, I would say.
I think you've got to, if you take an area like education or health or energy or something to do with the environment, clean water, these are important issues of public policy. They are fundamental to the future of society. So it's quite right and appropriate that elected governments and elected representatives want to have a view and are part of it. So I think the private sector and entrepreneurs need to be respectful and understanding, and it's too easy to be dismissive and disparaging of people who are trying to do what is an incredibly difficult job. And frankly, sometimes we don't help ourselves because we will overclaim or overstate. If I meet yet another app that is going to disrupt education and transform the world and have everybody knowing everything overnight, it doesn't work like that. So a bit of modesty on our own part I think helps sometimes as well. But I think your point is absolutely right. I think for social community-based entrepreneurs, it can be incredibly frustrating because you build something out, you can see it works, but then you deal with a whole series of vested interests who for one reason or another feel threatened by it. And I think I think you have to take a long-term view. You have to be respectful of the people around you. You have to build alliances and partnerships. You have to listen and try and stand in the shoes of your critics and understand why they feel as they do. And I'll come back to where I started. You've got to go with the evidence and the data and the outcome. And you have to be willing to demonstrate that over time, what you're doing actually works. And you have to be willing to be open and transparent and say, well, this didn't work, but what we learned from it was this. So, for example, through the Pearson Affordable Learning Fund, where we are investing in a whole series of social and community-based education projects around the world, fundamental requirement for Pearson to invest is that you're clear about what outcome will change as a result, that you're collecting the data by which you measure it, and that you'll be willing to share the results of that with the wider community. So I think we have to understand that we are also accountable for the communities we serve just as much as the policymakers are, and I think getting that balance right is important.
Sure. Michael?
I think what we've seen in Kenya as a result of, some countries in Africa, as a result of CoInnovation, what we've seen, what happened was the financial sector sort of took off with M-Pesa, and then the banks for a long time fought M-Pesa and tried to kick it out of the system. Now today, the banks are sort of embraced it. So the next level of innovation is where many banks have realized that they need to open up their what we call APIs. They need to open up their back office systems to allow innovators to plug into their back office systems. Recently, interestingly enough, I saw Citibank have a big, I'm sure they are sponsor here, they had a big innovation conference, which they went around the world, and they came to Kenya and they said, look, we want companies that could plug into our ecosystem. Okay, in terms of we'll open our APIs to you, and eventually they chose an e-commerce company in Kenya and a few other companies that won the award. And I think they're going to partner to deliver capability together because they realized alone they're not agile enough to execute. Then we also have what you begin to see is venture funds focused in industry. So for instance, we find Safaricom and Vodafone having put money out there to sort of fund innovative ideas, similar to what my colleague mentioned earlier. But also, what we are beginning to see government do is sort of insist on localization and local content. So you have a massive project with government. Maybe you're a French company or a German company, and you come to a country and you want to implement that project. So the government is sort of insisting that local content, you need to find a way to team up either with universities or entrepreneurs to make sure that local content is developed at a local level. Okay, that is critical because you're beginning to look at new ways of intellectual property creation. So there are many arguments around how do you create wealth in that whole ecosystem? How do you make sure that the big boys don't kick you out in the whole value chain? How do you make sure the government supports you? How do you create jobs? That's that whole ecosystem, and also the rule of law, intellectual property plays a key role in ensuring that you create a win-win kind of situation.
And I just want to jump in on what you were mentioning there in terms of the bank data. That's going to become a very interesting area, and you're starting to hear conversation all over the world in terms of unlocking access to bank data. And the key question is, whose data is it? Is it the bank's kind of proprietary data that they can monetize, or is it the customer data that should be made readily available? And I think that's just an interesting common thread that you're hearing in many different countries. So to come back to this idea of public policy, and I'd be curious to talk a little bit about that. What are the types of things that we're seeing policymakers do well around the world in terms of facilitating, responsible development of innovations and technologies? I heard the mention earlier of the idea of pilots, and I think that those have been very effective, and it seems to be a very good way to approach kind of traditional governments and say, hey, we can maybe pilot this and demonstrate with actual outcomes and data that this was effective. Is that something that you all have seen work well, or maybe there are certain types of collaborative working groups within government that are supposed to specifically focus on innovation and understand where things are moving? Is that?
I want to touch on this point, but also I want to go back to the establishment side. I think all we need to do is ask government to stay out of the way. As long as they don't really try to control policy, and as long as they are a regulator, not a participant in what's happening, the market itself will evolve. This trend that we're in is happening not just in Africa, not just in the developing world, in the Western world, in Europe. We're seeing industries being deconstructed from the energy utility industry that we've seen in Europe over the past 5 years. We're seeing it in the financial sector, in the education sector, less so in the healthcare sector because of the need, the massive need that we need in healthcare. Everything is needed, the old and the new. And a few others, the energy, the few other sectors. And we're seeing that happening in Africa as well as Europe. The establishment doesn't know how to deal with it. They are intrigued, they want to block it, they want to invest in it, they want to participate in it. And it's all these emotions are coming to play, and we're seeing a generation shift within the establishment. And what I mean by establishment is big corporates as well as family offices who the second generation want to move into the digital sector and not just have a sugar trading business sitting somewhere. All of these emotions are happening, and we're seeing some of it is blocking development, some of it is helping part of the development, but the wave we're seeing is massive. From our side, when we looked at the opportunity, we said there's a lot of interest on the early stage because everybody wants to participate at the idea level. We looked at over 100 incubator accelerator in Africa, Middle East, massive. This is a big number. We decided to focus our energy on the growth area. Companies with $5 to $20 million in revenue who really have crossed the hurdle, the test of surviving in difficult markets, and now need the expert advice and the smart money and the right capital, not just the 1 and 2 million, but the 5, 20, 30, 40 million to get them to the next stage. And those are the companies we want to back, because if you can build success stories, then it will be example for everybody to join.
I mean, in terms of what I think governments can do, I think the first thing is to study best practices. So I mean, a lot of people actually look at kind of what Israel did, because Israel had to kind of jumpstart an entire kind of tech industry, and it worked out pretty well for them. So I think it's kind of figure out what are the kinds of laws that you can enact that actually benefit people, maybe kind of tax benefits for business angels. Maybe a lot of governments shouldn't be investing directly in startups, but they can kind of fund private investors, by matching it. You put 50%, we put 50%, whatever the case may be, to kind of spur the kind of initial kind of venture capital or investment funds. And then removing all of the kind of penalties for entrepreneurship. So in Spain, for example, up until very recently, if your company failed, there wasn't really limited liability. Right? You would be held accountable for the rest of your life, and they would probably take away your house, and Social Security and all of the different expenses for the company would be personally held to you. So by removing those kinds of impediments, government can then kind of create an environment that's actually conducive to entrepreneurship. But I agree, they don't have to be overly involved. They just have to remove all of the kind of handicaps, and then, where possible, use the power that they do have, such as the money or kind of giving tax incentives to kind of facilitate entrepreneurial growth.
Yeah, I mean, with respect, I think in education as health, to suggest that government gets out of the way is not helpful. Because I think the size and scale of the challenge is one that requires sort of humility from all of us, but not timidity. And certainly our view would be, given the size and scale of the challenge, we'll work with anyone and everyone. And that means we'll work with social entrepreneurs, we'll work with the for-profit sector, we'll work with the private sector, we'll work with NGOs, and yes, we'll work with ministries of education as well. And frankly, education is so important to economic growth and civil society and everything else that it's not legitimate to expect a government to get out of the way. What I think governments can do is shift the focus to outcomes, to really be saying, let's be clear what we're measuring and what matters, enable their citizens to be informed in terms of being willing to share data on progress or lack of progress in an open and transparent way, take a long-term view. One of the big challenges in areas like education and health is the cycle of progress does not fit with the electoral cycle. And so people tend to go for the short-term initiative that gives the politician the headline or the photo call, rather than sticking with something that we'll see through. And I think creating what I would describe as a learning environment where it is okay to fail and there's an expectation and ability to learn from and share and sort of, build on each other's ideas. As we all know, innovation is, it's standing on the shoulders of giants, isn't it? It's learning from others, it's building from each other. And break away from, whether it's in education or health, too much of public debate is a sort of gotcha mentality where we're all trying to attack and criticise each other and trying to create an environment where there's much greater ability for people to learn and share and follow what the evidence tells us works.
Just to follow up on that, John, I just want to ask you, in your experience and what you're seeing around the world, are policymakers, regulators, if they're looking at outcomes, that makes a lot of sense to kind of ground policy based on real data, real measurement. But are they open to the kind of the innovative ideas at the outset that they're then testing with the outcomes-based data? There's kind of a chicken or egg there. They have to first allow that before you're even going to have the data to measure.
I think I think it varies country to country. I think it's getting better. I think, if you look at, here in the UK, the encouragement that's been given to academies and free schools, the growth of the charter school movement in America. I think you've got a very vibrant education sector in countries like China, Brazil and India, frankly, because you've got a rapidly growing middle class who is increasingly dissatisfied with state provision and therefore is investing their own money, actually as very poor families are doing in countries like Kenya as well. And I think governments are having to recognise that. But I think it's not an easy or simple thing for them to do. And then you have the teacher unions in some countries that are incredibly powerful, that are often fearful. Actually, their members are good people trying to do the right thing in their own classrooms each and every day, but collectively they're worried and fearful about what change means for them. So I think it's a sort of a mixed picture, but on the whole, I would be encouraged. And I think just look at the Sustainable Development Goals. We have, the Millennium Development Goals were very much measuring input from education, getting kids, universal basic enrollment. The Sustainable Development Goals 15 years on are much more about an outcomes-based approach. And I think that does show a greater sophistication in government view, but it's a mixed picture.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, Gary.
I was going to say, John, though, but don't you think that, because we're seeing that there's a lot of money being invested in ed tech, and not only in Europe and in Latin America, in the US as well. Don't you think that maybe, okay, there's a traditional model that's basically, let's say, mostly offline, but that increasingly there's a focus on the online environment and how that can kind of completely change the way that we learn that could then be disruptive to your business, or do you not see that as possible?
Yeah, I smiled privately when it was reassuring to know that I'm not the only person who uses the Kodak analogy within Pearson and Vodafone. And yes, of course I do. What I would say though is that I do worry that I have seen too many examples, particularly in some of the poorest countries in the world, where the minister stood up and done some big deal with some technology company or other and invested large amounts of money in some shiny new gadget that 5 years on had absolutely no impact on outcomes whatsoever. And what the data and evidence does tell us is that the solutions that are most likely to work in education are some form of blended approach, because learning is an active process. So the idea that you can download, if I can't read and write, the idea that I can download an app to my mobile phone and that of itself, hey presto, I'm going to be literate, isn't going to work. What technology can do, and really interesting, is create environments where we can learn and share from each other. So the technology has a hugely transformational and very disruptive role to play, but you've got to know how it fits as part of the wider ecosystem. I think it's a bit like in health, isn't it? Unless you understand the wider environment, it isn't going to work. So it's how you deploy that. But I think, yes, with that point, I think you're right.
John, on the education and the role of government, you don't want the role of government to be in the business where you are. You're a company that generates revenue, generates profits, and it's important that they don't get into this business. As a policy driver, regulator, as a social provider, there is a role for that. But they are behind the time in terms of innovation. And it's very difficult sometimes to bring them on board. I used to chair an organization called WorldLinks, an offshoot of the World Bank. We did technology training for teachers. We did it in the developing world, 35 countries. We partnered with governments, and we trained teachers to become master trainers to use technology in the classroom. That was a good thing to do. In a way, with the new innovation and online and smartphone, we either you innovate in a very strong way, or you get out of the way and you let the market actually take you to the next level. There's a whole new revolution of online education that we're seeing. A lot of it is early stage. Some of it is amazing, that is competing with the best of the world, coming from a developing market. The reason they're succeeding is because there is no interference around them, and they're allowed to do what they need to do. And that's important. The key is to allow that door to open up for them.
Yeah, I mean, I've probably taken your words too literally. But I think that just saying government get out the way completely isn't going to happen. I do think that where you are seeing the most progress is where government are clear that they have a funding role, that they have a strategic role in terms of saying how are we going to measure progress. They have an enabling role in ensuring their citizens are informed.
But they don't do it well.
And are able to make good decisions.
But they don't do it. They don't do it well.
So that's a role for government, and then allowing probably a more sort of multilateral approach to provision. So they don't try and do it in a monolithic way, but they do it in a wider way. That's not saying there isn't a role for government. It's a different, more strategic, less sort of 20th century role. Does that make sense?
Let me jump to Mike. Actually, I'm going to pose another question. I mean, Mike, you feel free to answer this one as well. But I also want to think a little bit about what are some of the risks associated with some of the innovation and technologies we've seen. I think it's related, perhaps to what John was just mentioning. And kind of a subset of that is there a risk that we start viewing technology as a panacea for solving all social challenges and don't think about the boots on the ground? I mean, there's still going to be teachers deploying technologies. There's still going to be the need for infrastructure within healthcare. You've got to have actual boots on the ground that are trained, educated, know how to use technology. So is there a risk that we go too far in assuming that technology can kind of solve all?
Okay, I'll sort of answer that question second.
That had
but
about 5
the first thing
parts,
is sort of explain how I think the argument between my two colleagues here is quite interesting, because how have we tried to resolve this in Kenya? Now, what we realized the government is the biggest spender. Now, you can't really walk away from government because they're going to spend big, right? If you're talking about health, who spends most in health? It's government. So what we realized as private sector, we need to sort of team up with government and create a vehicle. So what we did, we adopted the island model, which is the enterprise island structure of building or supporting innovation. So what we are putting up together is something called Enterprise Kenya. So Enterprise Kenya is going to play a role. It's sort of a public-private sector initiative, government having 30% of the board seats, private sector having 70% of the board seats. But people who sit on the board are going to be venture capitalists, some of the leading entrepreneurs. But the role of Enterprise Kenya is going to be a connector role. A connector role meaning if I'm an entrepreneur and I want to have access to the Ministry of Health, and I've got a great innovation around maternal health care, today as an innovator, it's almost impossible for you to get to the ministry because there are very many gatekeepers in the middle. So Enterprise Kenya is going to play the role of connecting you to the ministry because it has the right political support, it has the right ears of the right people in terms of conversation. It can also play a role in terms of helping you export your products internationally. So when you're talking about market access, Enterprise Kenya can play that role in line of teaming up with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Then also we thought, can government also play a role of investor role? So the government also realized, we do not have angel investors in our markets, so very few. So the government said, look, we're going to put X amount of $1 billion as angel investors in this business. So the government says, if we put $20 million out there, we are hoping that the private sector can match the 20 million. So the government is hoping over a period of 4 years, they eventually totally put $100 million of their own capital and private sector another $100 million. Already, private sector players have committed equivalent amounts of money as government to fund angel investing across these enterprises, which then can use Enterprise Kenya as a platform to learn from. And finally, also we also realized that what do entrepreneurs need? Service provision. For instance, if I'm a great entrepreneur and I need some very good legal advice around intellectual property, I'm not sure which legal firm I can go to, or do I have the capital to pay the legal firm? So government also decides through Enterprise Kenya, they'll create all these service provision roles within Enterprise Kenya to help entrepreneurs who are having these issues in terms of marketing, intellectual property, in that kind of array of things, initiatives. But at the same time, in terms of outcomes, what did we commit to government? Because government is also politicians, right? We committed we're going to create 180,000 jobs, which are measurable every year, because Enterprise Kenya can go to every company and look at the statistics of data. We committed to FDI in terms of attracting investors into these companies. We committed to. We started with the head of state and committed to these numbers. We committed to X amount of exports from the country into Africa and to other parts of the world. We committed intellectual property being built in Kenya, and also we committed to getting 100 global companies that are coming from Kenya into the world. That's what we committed to. Now those are commitments that we can be held accountable to. But in terms of what we also decided that it's impossible for us to innovate everything across the country. So we realized we are good at financial services. So we've done M-Pesa, great. We said, which other areas can we innovate and have a competitive advantage as a country? We realized we can innovate around health, okay, in terms of primary health care, delivery of health in Africa. We could be champions. We could be champions in agriculture. We could be champions in e-government. We could be champions in education. We could be champions in social services. So those are areas that are going to be of imperative focus for us as a country and around entrepreneurs who are going to rally behind areas of innovation around agriculture. So the government is playing a role. Private sector is playing a role. We are now getting other larger players to play a role, so such that even if you're an investor coming to Kenya, you're not coming and getting a whole myriad of conversations across the country. You're able to go to one-stop shop and have that conversation, which is important. Now, in terms of risks and product and looking at technology as the only way out, I think innovation is not about product and product only. It's about process innovation. Sometimes I think we focus too much about product. We forget about process innovation. Sometimes it's not a product. It's just process reengineering that brings change. We look at areas of finance innovation. It's not about products. Sometimes it's just about financial models that change everything. So I think there's definitely a lot of conversation around technology and products and everything else. But I think there are 8 process innovation. There are different types of innovation. Product is only one of them, right? And I think we focus because it's sexy, something we can talk about. But innovation is across the whole value chain, right? You need to figure out what problem are we trying to solve? I think the challenge we have, we build products and then we go out and say, okay, what solution can we plug them into? We need to look at the problem, then work backwards. Is it a process? Is it financial? Is it technology?
Interesting. John, you want to go? We'll just go down the line on this question.
Yeah, and I pick up your earlier point about how can technology really transform education. So a few years ago, we had the hype of the MOOCs, these massive open online courses that were going to transform the world of education. And then we found that there was only 4% completion rates on these courses, and the only people who were taking MOOCs were people who already had a university degree. So then, MOOCs go from sort of hero to zero in a year. But actually, there is a really important role for these MOOCs, but it is as part of the wider ecosystem in the way that you just described. So MOOC is a massive open online course. So this is this idea that the Harvard professor sits at the front of the class and anyone anywhere in the world can then access it. People didn't quite understand why they didn't work until Harvard did a little exercise where they tracked the brain activities of students for a week, simultaneously, 24 hours a day for a week. And they found that the students' brains were less active in a lecture theatre than they were when they were asleep in bed. And that the only time their brains were even less active than in the lecture theatre was when they were watching television. And the MOOC was essentially a televised lecture, so it didn't work. I mean, the theory was the reason why they didn't work, the brains were so inactive in the lecture theatre was it's the old Mark Twain quote that the lecture is the process by which the lecturer's notes becomes the student's notes without passing through the brain of either, But what they've done then is, so you go to, I was in India a couple of weeks ago, there's this huge test prep industry which is seen to have completely disrupted high school education in India. And what they've done there is these Harvard professors, a guy called Eric Mazur who won the Minerva Prize for breakthroughs in technology a couple of years ago, they have videoed the Harvard professors Each lesson starts with an 8-minute clip by the very best professor in the world presenting this concept in the most dynamic and engaging way you can imagine. That's played. But then the students using their mobile phones play a little game where they have to answer a question. And the technology then enables you to group the students, so you've got the one who got the right answer with 3 who got the wrong answer, and you get the 4 of them to sit and discuss and debate with each other. And then you ask the same question again 5 minutes later, and guess what? They all now have got the right answer, because we learn by doing, we learn by arguing, we learn by engaging with each other. So technology of itself cannot disrupt that process, but what it can in scale and replicate, enable it to share it much more widely. And that to me is a great example of how technology will play a hugely transformational role in education, but it requires you to think through as part of a wider ecosystem, and it doesn't displace the role of human engagement and activity in it, or social animals.
Thoughts on this side, in terms of risks associated with technology?
We talk about technology, and we're fortunate to have you with us today because it's probably the most important foundation for everything we can talk about, and it gets exciting. So I have a prediction. I have twins who are 3.5 years old, and I have a 12-week-old baby. And my prediction...
And you look wide awake right now, which is amazing.
There's a 50% chance that by the time my kids are in high school, that they'll do at least 1 year of their high school online and be traveling. And there's probably 60 to 70% chance that they'll do an online degree versus going to college physically. And if they do, they'll go a semester or 2 physically or somewhere that they like. That is the power and the force that we're seeing. We're seeing as well a new innovation. I'm working with a company now in Africa that has a 90% graduation rate. We've never seen anything in the world like that because they combine the high touch, the physical world, exactly, the tutoring, the relationship management. They're innovating not just from a technology perspective, but just from a process perspective. And we're seeing those innovations coming from a developing world because the need is so massive. Not everything is available. And guess what? They're making a lot of money and they're profitable at it. So that is exciting. And with that, companies like that gives you hope and excitement about the future and the potential we're looking forward to.
I mean, what I would say is I kind of look at John's story, and what I think is entrepreneurship is risk. I think that every time someone comes up with a new project, it's kind of almost destined to failure, right? Exactly. But the point is that it's kind of like a scientific experiment. You're basically testing a hypothesis, and you just keep working at it until you come up with a definitive solution that is acceptable to the market. So I think it's okay that MOOCs failed in the first iteration. The question is, what does the second iteration look like, the third, and people will learn from each of those. And of course, I believe that corporates have a role to play in this ecosystem. I know that when we first got here with Wayra, people were basically saying, what's Telefonica doing here? Get out. But I think that over time, each of the different players, government, corporates, entrepreneurs, investors, we all have a role to play as long as we can kind of coordinate that role amongst each other. I mean, I think that the point is, it seems to me that in some ecosystems, especially ecosystems that are still kind of more immature, everyone is fighting as to who is the kind of like essential owner of entrepreneurship, and that's really, really silly. I think that kind of right now, especially in developing economies or in more immature markets, what we all have to do is to work together, and then we can fight later when there's actually something to fight about.
All right, well, I'm going to try to take a few questions here at the end, so start thinking of your questions. But while you're thinking of them, I want to ask a question, get everyone's thoughts on this, hopefully keep your remarks relatively short. But do you all think that based on what we're seeing unfolding across the world and the scalability and efficiency that some of these new technologies and processes can bring, will we see kind of a convergence of populations? Are we going to see the rise of like a new global middle class that has a lot more in common with each other across the world than otherwise? Or is that maybe too optimistic of a view? So just give me 10 seconds on that now.
Absolutely. It's not about the middle class. It's about groups of interests around the world. They're going to aggregate. You could be a Kenyan and a Californian and a Singaporean who have and share common interests. And with technology, it allows you to interact. the structure of the way human interaction and the way we deal with who we are, where we belong, where we get educated. It's not just what university I went to anymore. The reason why I think my kids could go to online schooling and people say they might miss out on the social interaction at the school. My point is they're not getting the most efficient social interaction at the school. They'd rather interact with people around the world who share the same interest. And they can do that by being online. So we're seeing a total shift in the world, and the foundation is the world is becoming one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you are seeing a convergence. I mean, you see like entrepreneurs everywhere kind of copying each other's ideas and then kind of working with them. So like, you know, when I went to Lebanon, I thought they would be kind of fighting fighting ISIS or whatever, but that wasn't what happened. What you saw actually was that there was an entrepreneurial community there, very, very vibrant. The government was trying to figure out how to support it. And the ideas that they had there were the same ones that we saw in Egypt, the same ones that we saw in Poland. So I think that, yeah, the communication platforms that we have now are allowing people to share knowledge and information, and that means that we can all kind of evolve together.
Yeah, I mean, what's the phrase? The future's already with us. It's just not widely distributed yet. I mean, the fastest growing businesses in Pearson are exactly what you've described. It's virtual schooling and it's running online programs for universities around the world, and I think that will expand rapidly in much the way that you describe. But to your point, don't underestimate the importance for human beings of engaging with each other, meeting each other, the social side of it. So I think the technology and the social engagement always goes hand in hand.
Does education, I mean, do you see convergence in terms of educational standards and otherwise now as a result of these platforms?
It is starting to happen, and the whole bet that we've made is that education will emerge as a global sector over the next decade in much the way that healthcare has over the last 30 years. I think there are some limits to it because I think education by its very nature has, quite rightly, is local. So language, culture, community is important context. So I think it becomes more global. But I think the local community engagement and that local human interaction will always be important too.
Michael?
I think I like what my colleague mentioned in terms of groups of interests. I guess what will happen is that technology will transcend race at some point, religion, continents, gender. I think it will be about shared experiences. It's about you going to a restaurant, whether or not you're McDonald's in Egypt and in the UK. Right, and sharing the experiences, right, that will bring the next person into that whole ecosystem. So whether or not you're trying to buy a product, whether or not it's about advertising, whether it's about education, I think shared groups of interests are going to drive that conversation. It's not about middle class, or it's going to be anybody with capability to access the internet and relevant platforms. And the mobile is becoming a great product or a great device that allows that to happen seamlessly.
Okay, great. I think we do have time for a few questions. I see one here in the front.
Yes, one other...
Actually, if you'll hold for 1 second, you'll have a microphone. So.
Thanks. I'll just switch. It's on. Okay, my name is Louise Koch. I'm a head of CSI in the Danish Chamber of Commerce. Now, one of the other key actors on the ground when talking about access to services like health and education, that's and an actor that has been around for many years, is the development sector, the NGOs, the UN organizations, the World Bank, slightly different. How do you see the role of these organizations in this work? Are you just leapfrogging and overtaking, or do they have a role to play, or would they be too slow? What's your reflections on this?
I used to work with NGOs. I chaired an NGO. I was a big believer in NGO. I made the transition that I don't want to be an NGO. There's a role for NGOs, not to take away from that. I think the future is to have impact in businesses that are social, profitable, and can be scalable at a massive scale. NGOs have limitations of scalability if they always have to go for funding and convince people for doing what they need to do.
What we have been seeing as well is kind of like more local platforms. So there are a lot of entrepreneurs that know what the problems with NGOs are, and they've created organizations like change.org, or there are a lot of other different organizations or internet websites or whatever that allow you to actually get the impact that you're looking for without having to kind of go through this kind of established structure. And I think people are kind of disintermediating the NGOs in that way and just doing it for themselves.
Go ahead. I also.
Well, I
want
was
to
just say, I mean, we have a partnership with Save the Children around trying to provide education in refugee camps in Jordan. We're working with CamFed around girls' education across Africa. We are fellow shareholders, I think, with the World Bank and DFID in various sort of entrepreneurial-based social education projects. So, as I said earlier, we are completely Catholic in our approaches. We'll work with anyone and everyone who shares a common purpose and outcome of what we're trying to achieve.
I think we'll try to get one more question in back there, if we can pass that microphone. Oh, or...
I actually wanted to answer that question as well. I'm actually here from UNICEF, and my question was related to yours. We are launching we've launched a series of innovation labs across Africa, in different countries from Burundi to Zambia to Uganda to Nigeria, trying to combine government innovation, local innovators on the ground, and then invite external innovators in. And my question really was the opposite of yours, which was we need more help from people like yourselves on the panel, and how do we get this work done more quickly? I mean, we've been discussing education challenges for years and years and years, and yes, there's an improvement with the SDGs that they're more outcome-based, but frankly, we're not getting there fast enough. So my question was back to you. How do we at UNICEF and other institutions like us do it better? And we need your help to accelerate this work.
All right, well, the timer's flashing at us, but maybe we'll just each take 10 seconds to run down the line and answer that question. How do we do this potentially better and faster? And if you can do that in 10 seconds, that's really better and faster.
Make the underlying businesses social businesses with profitability, driving them to sustain a long-term existence.
Connect with members of the ecosystem who are trying to do similar things that can complement what you're doing. There are a whole bunch of organizations called Tech for Good, and to meet, put these different people in contact.
My colleague Kate James, who sat 3 rows in front of you, who's the mastermind of Project Literacy, which already is trying to bring a real broader community of interest together. I know we'd love to talk to you and follow up.
I think understanding your ecosystem will play a key role, because I know we've gotten lots of companies like yourself approaching us. The challenge is, I think, the approach you take to approach us is generally like, okay, should we do this? Like, maybe this is something we need to do as CSR. So we don't take it seriously enough, okay? Sometimes, that's the reason, right? So we need to figure out, when we come to us as entrepreneurs and innovators, right, how can we be partners? How can we look at a commercial aspect to this? Okay? How can we make it more sustainable? And how can you remove the complexity of your conversation? Sometimes you just need to simplify. And maybe the answer is reinventing yourself.
All right, well, thank you all very much for joining us, and I'd like to give a round of applause to our panelists for an excellent discussion.